Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Pierce called her in the break room, loud enough for everyone to hear. Just a nurse with a chart so incomplete it should have been labeled fiction. Just a nurse with hands that didn't know their place. St. Michael's ER in Denver smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency that makes your teeth ache if you listen too long. Ashley Cooper moved through the trauma bays like someone who'd learned to be invisible, her scrubs hanging loose on a frame that carried tension in the shoulders like a coiled spring wrapped in cotton. She kept her eyes down. She kept her voice measured. She kept the folded flag in her locker, 13 stars visible through the triangle window, belonging to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who died in her arms in Baghdad 14 months ago. When Ashley opened that locker between shifts, her right hand trembled for exactly 3 seconds before she forced it still and locked the trembling away where no one could see it. The unconscious John Doe arrived on a gurney at 6:08 a.m., wheeled in from a downtown alley near Union Station. No wallet. No phone. No identification. His left arm was tattooed with what might have been a unit insignia, but the ink had blurred with time and scarring. The paramedics had radioed ahead, male, 60s, collapsed respiratory status, possible sepsis. The ER was running at 94% capacity. 3 traumas. 2 overdoses. A pediatric asthma case that was trending worse despite nebulized albuterol. Ashley didn't get assigned to the John Doe. The attending physician, a resident named Dr. Yuki Okonkwo, got him. But when Yuki stepped away to make a phone call about ICU bed availability, the patient's left fur line began backing up, the saline dripping into the tissue around the vein instead of into the vessel itself. Infiltrated. Ashley saw it from across the bay and moved without thinking, a habit 14 years old, trained into her muscles in a field hospital that existed on military maps but not in any official records. "I've got this one," Ashley said quietly, pulling a fresh 18-gauge angiocath from the supply cart. Her voice was soft. It was always soft. The collapsed veins in this patient's arms were notoriously difficult, the skin paper-thin and the vessels already compromised. But Ashley's hands moved with the kind of precision that came from having placed central lines in patients dying on concrete floors with nothing but a flashlight and the sound of small arms fire echoing through cinder block walls. She felt for the vein in his right forearm, felt the subtle give of tissue that meant viable access, and slid the needle through. Flash! The golden flash of blood return. She threaded the catheter home and secured it with sterile tape, her movements economical, efficient, practiced beyond measure. "Nice work," Yuki said, returning from the phone call. "I couldn't get access on either side." Ashley nodded and said nothing. Saying nothing had become her particular genius. She'd been saying nothing for so long that the silence around her had become a kind of armor. Dr. Pierce entered the ER at 8:15 a.m. during grand rounds, his white coat crisp as fresh paper money, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that suggested he'd never walked on a floor that wasn't marble or hardwood. He was tall in the way that privilege makes people tall, shoulders back, chin high, moving through the trauma bay like he owned the air around him. Behind him came a cluster of surgical residents and medical students, the future of medicine trailing in his wake like remoras behind a shark. Pierce had been at St. Michael's for 3 years. He had privileges at 6 hospitals across Denver and Boulder. He had published papers with names like Optimizing Nursing Accountability in High Acuity Settings and The Cost of Undertrained Support Staff. He had a brother-in-law on the hospital board. He did not have the kind of presence that made people feel safer. He had the kind of presence that made oxygen feel harder to find. Ashley was at the nurse's station, updating the John Doe's chart, vitals logged, for placement documented, time-stamped and initialed, when Pierce stopped in front of the desk and pulled the chart from her hands like he was confiscating evidence. "This," Pierce said, holding the chart up so the residents could see it, "is an example of dangerously incomplete documentation from undertrained staff. Look at this for notation: no pump rate recorded, no infusion pressure parameters, no note about the infiltrated line. This chart suggests an incompetent clinician." The words fell into the trauma bay like stones into still water. The ripples spread outward, touching everyone, landing heaviest on Ashley. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up from her computer. She continued charting as if Pierce's voice was just another machine humming in the background, the ventilator, the monitors, the fluorescent lights, the white coat inflating itself with certainty. I documented the placement, Ashley said quietly, her fingers continuing to move across the keyboard. And I noted the previous infiltration. You documented placement, Pierce repeated, as if the words were an insult. You didn't document troubleshooting. You didn't document vein assessment. You didn't document why this wasn't a central line. He turned to the residents. This is why we can't let nurses make clinical decisions. They lack the foundational knowledge to understand the hierarchy of access methods. Ashley's jaw tightened. Not because the words hurt, she'd learned long ago that words from men like Pierce were just air moving through her mouth. Her jaw tightened because she was thinking about the last central line she'd placed 7 weeks ago in a bunker outside Fallujah, using a subclavian approach on a sergeant with a tension pneumothorax, and how that sergeant had walked out of there alive because she'd known exactly what she was doing. But that sergeant, that bunker, that entire chapter of her life, it had been officially erased. The records were sealed. The unit was classified. Operation Phantom Autumn existed only in memory now, not in any database that mattered. Pierce returned the chart to the desk with deliberate disrespect, tossing it so it scattered slightly. The residents followed him on rounds. The bay settled back into the steady rhythm of machines and soft voices and the fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical prayer. At 10:51 a.m., Ashley retrieved her coffee from the break room vending machine. The machine was ancient, mechanical, the kind that required you to feed it dollar bills that it rejected half the time. She'd brought exact change, as always. 50 cents in quarters, each one earned from overtime shifts she'd picked up because the rent on her one-bedroom apartment was $1,200 a month and the stipend from the VA was classified and the child support payments for Jake had become a private arrangement because she couldn't explain to any judge why the government wouldn't acknowledge her rank or her service years. She pressed C7. The machine whirred. The coffee cup dropped. The hot water dispensed with a sound like a creature sighing. Combat medic correspondence courses, Dr. Pierce said behind her, his voice carrying to the surgical residents who'd followed him into the break room like ducklings. That's what some of these nurses think gives them surgical training. A 6-week online certification. They read one book about emergency medicine and suddenly they think they're trauma surgeons. He poured himself a cappuccino from the espresso machine that the hospital had installed for physician use only. That poor fellow in Bay 4, the one with the infiltrated line, probably thought she was performing microsurgery. That's the problem with the nursing profession now. No standards. No gatekeeping. Any competent person can pass the boards. Ashley's hand, wrapped around the paper cup of coffee, remained perfectly still. The warmth of the liquid seeped into her palm. She did not turn around. She did not defend herself. She did not say anything about the 3 years she'd spent in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment's medical unit, or the Advanced Trauma Life Support certification she'd earned before being qualified for source selection, or the field thoracotomy she'd performed on a Black Hawk pilot using a combat knife because they were 3 clicks from extraction and the chest tube kit had been destroyed in the crash. She simply held her coffee and let the words pass through her like wind through a ghost. One of the residents laughed, a nervous, uncertain laugh, the laugh of someone not sure if mockery was permitted but eager to please the man in the crisp white coat. "I need some Jell-O," Ashley said softly, moving past Pierce toward the break room refrigerator. Her voice was so quiet that only one of the residents heard it. That resident blinked. That resident almost smiled. But Pierce didn't hear her. Pierce didn't hear anything that didn't come from someone with the letters TMD after their name, and even then he was selective about whose voice mattered most. At noon, the John Doe, the unconscious man in Bay 4 with no wallet and no history and no identification, began showing signs of response to stimuli. His fingers flexed. His eyes moved beneath closed lids. His respiratory rate climbed from 15 to 22 breaths per minute. The cardiac monitor showed a steady sinus rhythm, the green line climbing and falling in its algorithmic dance. Somewhere in the chambers of his heart, electricity was firing in a pattern that suggested consciousness, that suggested a person was swimming back toward the surface of the world. Ashley was running labs from another patient when she passed Bay 4. The John Doe's gown had shifted during bed adjustments, sliding down from his left shoulder. And beneath his collar, caught in the knot of his hospital gown's tie, she saw something metal. Something that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back at her in a way that metal only did when it was worn close to skin, when it had been against a chest for so long it had absorbed body heat and become part of someone's identity. She moved into the bay, ostensibly to check his fall line, and angled her body to shield the view from the nurse's station. Her fingers found the tags beneath the gown's neckline and lifted them carefully into the light. The metal was warm. The inscription was precise, stamped clearly into the surface: Captain Marcus Webb, U.S. Army Ranger, 75th Ranger Regiment, 1st Battalion, Delta Company. Blood type O positive. A service number that corresponded to a unit that existed but whose operations were classified above most clearance levels. And beneath that, an emergency contact number that Ashley's hands recognized before her mind did. It was the same phone number that had called her house on Thursday nights at precisely 1900 hours for the last 3 years. The same voice that had guided her son Jake through selection week at Fort Benning. The same officer who had written 14 letters detailing the fundamentals of small unit tactics and the importance of understanding your soldier's capabilities, each letter signed with a call sign hammer and a signature that Jake had studied like scripture. That Jake had told her, 2 months ago, had probably saved his life in the mountains when he'd thought about quitting, and Hammer's words, about how the strongest people he'd ever known were the ones who'd kept going after they wanted to stop, had crystallized into resolve. Ashley's hand trembled. Not because the recognition was shocking. Not because the coincidence seemed impossible. Her hand trembled because she understood, in the split second before she forced her body still, that this man, unconscious in a hospital gown in Denver, Colorado, was the only person in 3 years who had known who she actually was. Who had written to her son not as a stranger offering mentorship but as a warrior recognizing another warrior's child. Who had somehow, without ever acknowledging her directly, been honoring the unspoken compact that existed between soldiers, that they carried each other's ghosts. She looked up. No one was watching. The nurse's station was focused on a new admission rolling through the trauma bay doors. Pierce was gone, probably making rounds in the ICU, still waiting for someone to challenge him, still hunting for incompetence to weaponize. Ashley slipped the dog tags into her scrub pocket, feeling them settle against her hip bone, feeling the weight of them like a contract being signed. She tucked the gown back up around the captain's shoulders and checked his full line with professional distance and absolute stillness. The machines around his bed continued their steady conversation with each other, the ventilator breathing, the monitors singing their electronic hymn. But something had changed in the bay. Something had shifted. And the room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The security guards arrived 45 seconds later, their uniforms cutting through the trauma bay like steel through silk. Ashley set down the blood pressure cuff with deliberate care, each movement exact, controlled, measured. She didn't look at Pierce. She didn't need to. His voice was still reverberating through the bay, a tank idling in a garage, heavy and dark and utterly convinced of its own power. Nurse Cooper is experiencing confusion about scope of practice, Pierce said, his tone professorial, the kind of voice a man uses when he's already won. Please escort her from this bay. The guards looked uncomfortable. They were young, probably hospital security pulled from desk duty, not trained for this kind of thing. One of them made a small gesture toward the door. Ashley nodded once, just once, and walked out. Her composure was a locked vault. No tremor in her hands. No flush of anger rising up her neck. Just movement, fluid and precise, the same way she'd walked out of field hospitals in Baghdad when the orders came down from command. The same way she'd learned to disappear. She heard Pierce's voice continuing behind her as the trauma bay door swung shut, "Return to your station, nurse." The emphasis on the last word was a slap dressed up as professionalism. The patient went to surgery 40 minutes later. He survived. Barely. Ashley knew this because she checked the surgical log at 2 a.m. while the night shift skeleton crew moved like ghosts through the empty corridors. Internal bleeding, exactly as her clinical judgment had predicted. Exactly as her hands had tried to tell Pierce before he decided that his medical degree made him the only person in that room qualified to think. But what Pierce filed in his office the next morning was an incident report citing insubordination and scope of practice violations. It was the 7th report in 6 months. The stack of documentation was growing in a manila folder that Ashley had seen him carrying, thick with papers, each form another nail, another step, another calculated move toward termination. She realized the strategy only slowly. This wasn't random. This was methodical. Pierce was building a case the way a prosecutor builds a conviction, layering evidence, establishing a pattern, creating a narrative where Ashley Cooper was a danger, a liability, someone who couldn't follow orders. Someone whose judgment was unreliable. Someone who needed to go. The break room vending machine became a test she learned to fail. She stopped going at the times Pierce frequented it. She took her coffee black instead of waiting for the cream dispenser. She changed her lunch schedule, moved her shift preferences, made herself small enough to avoid his orbit. But small wasn't working. He was creating visibility through absence, and every empty space in his incident reports had her name written through it. On Wednesday, during grand rounds, Pierce stood before 30 residents and attending physicians in the conference room on the 3rd floor, holding up a patient chart, not hers, but the message was directed at her with the precision of a laser sight. "This is what happens when we lower standards," he announced, his voice carrying to the back row where Ashley stood, her gaze fixed on her notepad. "Dangerously incomplete documentation from undertrained staff who think a correspondence course makes them qualified." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room found her anyway, turned toward her like a flock of birds shifting direction in a single synchronized movement. "Perhaps our combat medic should stick to taking temperatures," Pierce continued, and the surgical residents scattered their laughter through the room like coins dropped on linoleum. Ashley's pen continued moving across the page. Her handwriting stayed perfectly steady, each letter formed with the same care she'd once used filling out casualty reports. The tremor never came. Not in public. Never in public. After rounds, she walked to the break room. She needed coffee, actually needed it, not just as a ritual but as fuel. Pierce arrived exactly 30 seconds later with 2 residents trailing him like satellites orbiting a sun. He fed coins into the machine with the casual confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to take up space in any room. "I'm just saying," he announced, his voice deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear, "nurses who think combat medic correspondence courses make them clinicians are a danger to patients. You can put a bandage on a soldier and call yourself a hero, but this is medicine." One of the residents smiled nervously. The other one stared at his shoes. "Right, G.I. Jane," Pierce called out as Ashley retrieved her coffee. She passed him without a word. Her face was a mask, not the mask of someone hiding emotion, but the mask of someone who'd learned that emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. The mask of someone who'd stood in field hospitals while mortars fell and learned that crying was something you did alone, if you did it at all. She didn't cry until she reached the stairwell. 3 flights up, in the concrete silence where the fluorescent lights hummed with an industrial flatness, her hand finally shook. Just for a moment. Just enough to spill a drop of coffee onto the step below her. She watched it spread across the concrete like a small wound opening. Then she kept climbing. For 2 days after that, she monitored John Doe, Captain Webb, from a distance, checking his chart when Pierce wasn't watching, reading the monitor from the hallway instead of at the bedside. Webb remained unconscious, his vitals stable but concerning. Heart rate holding steady at 68 beats per minute. Blood pressure 128/74. Oxygen saturation 94% on room air. Everything normal. Everything fragile. Everything that could change in the space between one breath and the next. She couldn't call Jake. Couldn't explain why his commander was lying in a hospital bed in Denver with no ID and no one looking for him. Couldn't risk the attention, couldn't risk the questions, couldn't risk anything that might pull the thread of the story she'd spent 7 years weaving, the story of a nurse named Ashley Cooper with an ordinary past and ordinary credentials and absolutely nothing of interest to anyone. On her lunch break Thursday, she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot and pulled out the last letter Webb had sent her son. The envelope was worn from being read and reread, the edges soft as fabric. "Rangers lead the way, Jake," the letter read in Webb's precise, careful handwriting. "When things get hard, remember you come from people who don't quit. Your mother taught you that. I'm just reminding you." Her fingers tightened on the paper. She folded it back into her wallet beside a photograph of Jake in uniform, his face serious and determined and so young it made her chest feel like something inside it was breaking. That night, during her shift, Webb's monitor began to alarm. Ashley reached his bedside in 3.8 seconds. She counted the steps later, measured her response time against the numbers, the way she'd learned to do in combat. His blood pressure was crashing. The digital readout dropped from 118 down to 96 in the space of a heartbeat, 94, 88, 82. His oxygen saturation was falling like a stone dropped into dark water. 91. 87. 82. His jugular veins were distended, swollen, visible, pushing against the skin of his neck like something trying to escape. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the heart, crushing it like a fist closing. She hit the code button. Alarms began shrieking through the unit, the sound of 12 people moving at once, the controlled chaos of an ER knowing death was approaching. Ashley's mind was calculating even as her hands moved toward the oxygen, toward the 4 stand, toward the crash cart being pushed in from the hallway. 3 minutes before brain damage. Maybe 5 before permanent death. Maybe less. Pierce arrived like he'd been standing outside the door waiting for his moment. He surveyed the monitors, the falling numbers, the patient whose pupils were already beginning to dilate with hypoxia. "Prep him for the cath lab," Pierce barked. "We'll do a pericardiocentesis under fluoroscopy." Ashley's mind raced through the mathematics of death. The cath lab was 2 floors away. 10 minutes minimum to prep the room, another 5 to position the fluoroscopy equipment, another 3 to guide a needle through the chest wall into the pericardial space and drain the blood. Webb didn't have 10 minutes. He didn't have 5. "Dr. Pierce, he needs an emergency thoracotomy now, here, or..." "You do not question my orders." Pierce's voice was the crack of a whip. "Someone get her out of here." But Ashley was staring at Webb's monitor, watching the numbers fall like a countdown towards 0, and suddenly she wasn't in Denver anymore. She was in Baghdad, in a forward surgical team compound with no walls, just canvas and sand and the sound of mortars walking across the city like a giant's footsteps. She could hear Lieutenant Sarah Chen's voice, clear and steady and afraid, "Cooper, you're the only one who can do this." Her hands remembered the weight of a combat knife. They remembered the feel of ribs opening under pressure, the warmth of blood, the precise anatomy that kept people alive. A trauma nurse pushed the crash cart closer to the bedside. Ashley saw the scalpel kit sitting on top of it, the instruments arranged like a question waiting to be answered. And that's when the room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze in the next bay over. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and indifferent. Webb's heart rate was dropping. 42. 40. 38. The numbers on the monitor scrolled downward like a countdown nobody wanted to watch. Ashley stood at the bedside, her hand steady on the 4 line, watching the rhythm deteriorate into something that looked less like a heartbeat and more like a whisper, long stretches of flat line punctuated by desperate electrical spikes that meant nothing. The cardiac monitor wasn't just alarming. It was screaming. Pierce was on the phone. His voice carried that particular pitch of a man accustomed to being obeyed, the vocal equivalent of a blade being drawn. "Cardiology. Now. I need the cath lab prepped for emergent bypass. Captain Webb, no, Marcus Webb, Army Ranger, arriving from ER via priority ambulance in approximately 8 minutes." He paused, listening, his jaw tightening. "I don't care if they're in the middle of a procedure. This is time sensitive. Do it." He hung up without goodbye, a man for whom courtesy was a tool he deployed selectively and now saw no reason to deploy at all. 8 minutes. The monitor showed 32. Then 30. Ashley's eyes moved from the screen to pierce to Webb's pale face. In the harsh fluorescent light, Webb looked like a man already losing his grip on this side of things. His skin had taken on the waxy quality of profound shock. His chest barely moved with each breath the ventilator forced into his lungs. Around them, the ER was the controlled chaos of a Wednesday evening, gurneys moving past, a woman in Bay 3 crying about her daughter, the distant wail of an ambulance approaching, but their small corner of the hospital had shrunk to Webb's bedside and the digital readout that was now showing 30 beats per minute. 30 beats per minute in a man whose body needed at least 45 to perfuse his vital organs. Below that number, you were running on fumes. Below that, the brain started to die. 3 minutes to get to the cath lab. 3 minutes to position him on the table. 3 minutes to thread a catheter through his arteries and balloon open the blockage that was killing him. 9 minutes, minimum, if everything moved like water downhill and the cardiologist was already scrubbed and ready, which he wasn't. The cardiologist was probably eating dinner or dictating notes or doing whatever cardiologists did when they weren't saving lives. 12 minutes realistic. Webb had maybe 6. Pierce was already moving toward the phone again, his face set in the expression of a man solving problems the way he'd been taught to solve them, with authority, with resources, with the assumption that his rank and his orders would bend reality into compliance. He didn't see what Ashley saw. He couldn't have. Pierce had trained in a world where problems arrived in orderly sequences, where you called the specialists and waited for them to arrive, where time was something you negotiated with rather than something that negotiated with you. But Ashley had spent 18 hours in Baghdad holding a field hospital together while mortar rounds walked across the roof in a pattern designed to kill her. She'd done it with 6 medics and 4 nurses and a trauma surgeon who'd taken shrapnel in the shoulder on hour 4 and never stopped working. She'd done it in a compound that smelled like blood and diesel exhaust and the particular metallic stench of combat that didn't wash off. You had to wait for it to fade on its own, days later, when you realized you could smell grass again. In that compound, 18 hours straight, she'd learned how time worked when it was working against you. Webb's rhythm was deteriorating. Not crashing, not yet, but deteriorating the way a dying animal deteriorates, with that gathering inevitability that meant the moment of no return was approaching at a sprint. 28. The number climbed slightly, 30, then fell again. The rhythm was erratic now, unstable, the kind of electrical chaos that meant the heart was trying and failing, like a boxer in the 9th round whose legs had stopped listening to his brain. Pierce had his phone to his ear again, barking something about crash carts and ensuring ICU had a bed, his voice the sound of a man still operating under the assumption that institutional resources and proper protocols could outwit biology. They couldn't. Not this time. Not with 6 minutes becoming 5, 5 becoming 4, the monitor now showing a pattern that was barely compatible with conscious thought. Ashley's hands were moving before her mind had fully formed the decision. It was the way body memory worked in professionals, the knowledge living not in the brain but in the muscles, in the nerve pathways carved by repetition. She turned toward the crash cart. The scalpel kit was there, the instruments arranged in their sterile field like a question waiting to be answered. The question was simple: do you watch him die on schedule, or do you break every rule you've ever been given? The dog tags were still in her pocket. She could feel them there, a weight against her ribs. Marcus Webb had written to Jake for 8 months. Rangers don't quit. That's what his last letter said. Jake had it memorized. He'd read it to Ashley during FaceTime from Ranger School, his voice shaking with a kind of determination that only existed in 17-year-old boys who'd found something to believe in. Marcus Webb had given her son that belief. The monitor showed 26. Pierce was saying something about pressors and vasoconstrictors, his voice the tone of a man checking boxes, following the algorithm that lived in medical textbooks and hospital protocols. The algorithm that assumed you had time. The algorithm that worked when you had time. But the algorithm was written by people who'd never stood in a field hospital in Baghdad with incoming fire and a soldier bleeding out and exactly 47 seconds to decide whether saving this life was worth the risk of losing your own. She decided to save him. She'd saved all of them, that night. held them together with her hands and her will and her refusal to accept the arithmetic of death. She'd kept them breathing. She'd kept them alive. She'd done it while the world tried to blow her and her unit into component pieces. Webb had 30 seconds before the deterioration became irreversible. The brain could survive without blood for maybe 4 minutes. 3 if you were lucky. 2 if you weren't. The body gave you warnings. The monitor gave you time in the form of numbers. When those numbers stopped talking, when the rhythm became nothing but a flatline whisper, you could push every drug in the arsenal and it wouldn't matter. The electrical activity would be gone. The heart would stop trying. Ashley reached for the scalpel kit. Her hands were steady. They always were. Steadiness under pressure wasn't something you learned in nursing school. It came from somewhere else, from a place that had been forged in a compound in Baghdad where the windows rattled from incoming and the man in Bay 4 had an arterial bleed and she had a knife and the knowledge that she was the only one who could stop him from bleeding out on a cot with his mother's name on his lips. Pierce was still talking. His voice had become background noise, the sound of institutional machinery grinding forward on its predetermined course. Ashley's world had narrowed to the cardiac monitor and Webb's chest and her own hands, which knew what to do. They always knew. The knowledge was muscle memory carved so deep that consciousness was almost an obstacle to it. The monitor showed the pattern spiking again, the rhythm deteriorating further, the electrical activity of the heart becoming increasingly chaotic, which meant increasingly desperate, which meant increasingly futile. 22. The number was a countdown now, and Ashley understood in the way that field medicine had taught her that some countdowns didn't end in 0. They ended in the moment you finally stopped trying. She would not stop trying. She tore open a sterile field and reached for the scalpel. The scalpel felt like coming home. Ashley's fingers closed around it with the muscle memory of 1,000 field surgeries, her hand moving before her mind caught up, sterile field, blade angled, and the first incision opened Webb's chest like unlocking a door she'd opened in darker places. The fluorescent lights above blazed white and indifferent. Dr. Pierce screamed something about protocol, about security, about authorization she didn't have and wouldn't wait for. She didn't hear him. She heard only the hiss of air escaping from a collapsed left lung, the wet sound of fluid under pressure, the silence of a room that had stopped breathing alongside their patient. Her hands moved like surgical instruments themselves, steady, precise, belonging to someone who had held lives together in the space between heartbeats. The intercostal space opened. She could see it now, the pericardium distended with blood, the heart trapped beneath fluid and pressure, drowning in its own container. This was why Webb was coding. This was why the cardiology team wouldn't arrive in time. This was why she had 3 minutes and no other choice. The knife was small, sharp, made for exactly this. The pericardial window opened. Blood spilled like a confession. Pressure released. The heart, suddenly free, began to beat again on its own. O2 climbing. 72. 80. 84. The monitor's rhythm shifted from flatline chaos to something almost human. Pierce had stopped screaming. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum, that persistent electrical sound underneath everything, the sound of a hospital trying to stay alive. Ashley's hands didn't shake. They never shook. She was already thinking about closure, about repair, about the secondary bleed she could feel pooling beneath her fingers. Muscle memory. All of it. Every procedure her army training had taught her, every midnight in Baghdad when there was no time for hesitation and no room for doubt. Get an attending, she said quietly. Not a request. It was a command. Her voice had dropped an octave. Nobody moved. Get an attending. Now. A resident bolted. Pierce was still frozen at the edge of the trauma bay, his authority shattered like glass on tile. He opened his mouth. Closed it. She had already moved past him in her mind, already 5 steps ahead, already doing what needed doing while he stood there trying to process how a nurse had just performed a procedure that saved a man's life. The pressure relief had worked. Webb's rhythm had stabilized. The code was no longer a code. It was a recovery. It was a win. It was the moment everything changed and there would be no walking it back. Security arrived 40 seconds later, but by then the attending physician was already in the trauma bay, already looking at the open chest cavity, already seeing exactly what had happened and understanding exactly why it had worked. Their eyes met hers for 1 second, not approval, not yet, but something like recognition. The look of someone who'd just watched a transformation. The look of someone who understood that what they were witnessing didn't fit into any regulatory box. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 3 in the morning when Dr. Pierce sat in his office with a fresh cup of coffee and began to document the incident with the precision of a man building a gallows. His fingers moved across the keyboard like a lawyer writing a suicide note. Unauthorized surgical procedure performed by nursing staff. Gross negligence. Immediate termination recommended pending criminal investigation. Each word was a nail. Each sentence was another brick. He'd spent 6 months building a file on Ashley Cooper and now she'd handed him the final piece, the one that proved everything he'd suspected. She was operating outside her scope of practice, she was dangerous, she was a threat to hospital operations and patient safety, and she needed to be removed immediately. His email to the hospital attorney was meticulous. Professional. Devastating. The sun came up over Denver gray and cold. Ashley returned to St. Michael's not as a nurse but as someone surrendering. She'd been called to HR immediately, her shift cancelled, her badge requested before she'd even removed her jacket. She walked past the nurse's station and felt the weight of every eye that wouldn't meet hers. A young nurse she'd trained last month looked away. The respiratory therapist suddenly became very busy with equipment. This was what professional death looked like. This was what happened when you stepped outside the invisible lines that kept people like her invisible. Her locker opened to reveal the folded flag, Lieutenant Sarah Chen's flag, the one Chen's family had pressed into Ashley's hands at the funeral in Arlington, the one that had traveled with her through 3 years of hiding, 3 years of being nobody, 3 years of living inside a story someone else had written for her. She held it for a moment, her thumb tracing the stars, the cloth soft and ancient from being folded and refolded 1,000 times by hands that still ached with the memory of losing her. The flag was all she had left. The flag and the dog tags in her pocket, still warm against her ribs, still belonging to a man she'd just saved and would probably never see again. She returned to the hospital laundry without being asked. The chemical smell of institutional detergent replaced the memory of desert sand, of dust, of the particular odor of blood under a Baghdad sun. She folded her blue scrubs with the same precision she'd once used on her uniform, each crease sharp as a blade, each fold a small meditation on endings. The laundry worker, a woman in her 60s named Maria, watched her with an expression Ashley couldn't name. Pity, maybe. Recognition, possibly. Maria had probably folded clothes for 30 years. She'd seen nurses come and go. She'd probably never seen anyone fold hospital scrubs like they were folding their own life into submission. Ashley placed the final folded pile into the bin and didn't look back. In his office, Pierce opened a new investigation. Not the internal kind. The official kind. He contacted the Colorado Board of Nursing with a request for a full credential audit. His email was casual, almost conversational, but the implications were surgical. Nurse Cooper's demonstrated skills appear to exceed her documented training level. Recommend verification of her RN license and relevant certifications. Pattern suggests possible credential fraud. He CC'd the hospital attorney. He CC'd the state nursing board. He CC'd 3 people who would CC 3 more people until it became official and irreversible. He was convinced now. Absolutely certain. She had fabricated her license. She had bought credentials online or forged them or stolen them somehow. Because how else could a nurse who'd taken a mail-order combat medic correspondence course perform a field thoracotomy? The answer had to be fraud. It couldn't possibly be anything else. Meanwhile, in the ICU 3 floors above, Captain Marcus Webb's eyes fluttered open. The morphine hung around him like fog, softening the edges of consciousness, making the ceiling tiles swim. A nurse, not Ashley, he didn't recognize this one, checked his vital signs and told him where he was. You're at St. Michael's. You're safe. Webb's hand moved to his chest, searching, and found only surgical tape and bandages. His dog tags were gone. He couldn't feel them. Who did the surgery? He asked, his voice rough like gravel. The nurse hesitated. That hesitation meant everything. A nurse named Ashley Cooper. She's been suspended. She saved your life. Webb's eyes sharpened despite the drugs, cutting through the morphine haze like a man waking from a nightmare. Ashley Cooper. Phantom. The name hit like artillery. His hand moved to the call button and he pressed it, not the gentle press of a patient, but the urgent command of someone who'd just understood that the person who'd saved him was about to disappear forever. I need a phone. Now. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of command. I need a phone. Now. The gravity of the moment hadn't fully landed yet. In 3 hours, everything would change. In 3 hours, a Marine colonel would walk through those ER doors in dress blues. In 3 hours, the entire narrative would flip like a card table. But right now, at 6 in the morning, with Ashley folding her last set of scrubs and Pierce filing his final documentation and Webb staring at his phone trying to remember a number that had been classified for 4 years, none of them knew yet. None of them understood that the quiet nurse who'd saved his life was about to become something far more visible, far more dangerous to everyone who'd underestimated her. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then everything began. 3 hours. That's how long it took for the entire hospital to stop recognizing the woman standing in the ICU. Captain Marcus Webb's eyes opened at 3:44 p.m., the morphine haze lifting just enough for clarity to break through. His hand moved to the fall line, then stopped. He looked up at the nurse adjusting his monitor, the same nurse who'd pulled him out of a burning Humvee in Baghdad 8 years ago, and his voice came out paper-thin but unmistakable. Phantom. That single word. Her call sign. The name only 4 people on Earth still knew. The corridor filled before Ashley could respond. Not a trickle. A wave. Military dress uniforms materialized in the doorway like a tide rolling in, Marines in dress blues, Army officers with chest full of ribbons, a Navy captain with insignia that made enlisted personnel's spines straighten on instinct. They didn't belong in an emergency room. They'd never belonged anywhere except classified briefings and Pentagon corridors. They moved through St. Michael's like they owned the building, their presence changing the air pressure itself, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived wars. A Marine colonel stepped forward, dress uniform so pressed it could draw blood, his bearing like tempered steel. He held a leather folder embossed with the Department of Defense seal. His voice carried the kind of authority that made people move without questioning. He began reading, and the words hung in the ICU like artillery fire. Captain Ashley Marie Cooper. For conspicuous gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty while serving with Joint Task Force Phantom in Baghdad, Iraq. Under sustained enemy mortar and small arms fire, Captain Cooper maintained field medical operations for 18 consecutive hours, providing life-saving treatment to 23 personnel despite direct threats to her position. She voluntarily remained exposed to enemy fire to save the life of a fellow officer while simultaneously directing return fire from defensive positions. The colonel paused. Silver Star. Dr. Pierce pushed through the crowd like he was swimming against a current that wouldn't stop crushing him. His face had drained to the color of old concrete. This is my hospital. I don't know what this is, but I have documentation. I have incident reports. I have evidence of. Continue, the colonel said, not looking at Pierce. His eyes remained on Ashley, and when he spoke, his voice had the weight of a man who'd sent soldiers into fire. Paragraph 4 described a field extraction under enemy contact. Paragraph 5 detailed a Bronze Star with valor for rendering aid to wounded combatants while under direct sniper fire. The colonel's hand moved to his chest, a salute rendered to decorations that Dr. Pierce could not see, would never see, was not worthy of seeing. Pierce's voice climbed higher. She performed an authorized surgery. She violated protocol. She has no credentials to. The hospital corridor went absolutely silent. The kind of silence you could cut with a trauma shear. A woman stepped through the crowd, not military, but carrying herself with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years navigating bureaucracy as a weapon. DEAR. The acronym hung in the air like a siren nobody wanted to hear. When she spoke, her voice was the sound of professional destruction delivered with administrative courtesy. Captain Pierce, sorry, Dr. Pierce, we need to discuss your patient charts dating back to 2019. Specifically, the surgical records showing 3 patient deaths attributed to nursing error. Specifically, the subsequent alterations to those charts. Specifically, the federal investigation currently examining whether those alterations constitute insurance fraud, falsification of medical records, and second-degree manslaughter. Pierce's attorney appeared in the doorway. Where had he come from, and touched Pierce's elbow with the kind of grip that said stop talking now or die later. 2 hospital security officers flanked them, moving with the choreography of men who'd been briefed by federal agents. Dr. Pierce, you need to come with us, the attorney said. Not a request. A command. Pierce looked around the corridor, at the nurses emerging from patient rooms, at residents he'd trained, at respiratory therapists he'd screamed at the entire institution he'd spent 6 years terrorizing. This is absurd. She's the one who violated every protocol. She's the criminal here. Webb's voice cut through, weak but clear, rising from the ICU bed like a flag planted in hostile territory. She performed a field thoracotomy that saved my life when you wanted to waste 15 minutes transferring me to another floor. I'd be dead if she'd followed your orders. Just like I'd be dead in Baghdad if she hadn't pulled me out of a burning Humvee while under enemy fire. Ashley's head snapped up. She met Webb's eyes across the crowd of uniforms and credentials and federal agents. Something unspoken passed between them, 18 years of classified operations, of smoke and blood and chaos, of survival purchased at the price of erasure. The hospital CEO arrived next, summoned by emergency page, her face shifting through recognition and horror and calculation in the span of 2 seconds. She took in the scene with the kind of grim assessment a captain uses when evaluating whether the ship can still float. Military personnel. Federal agents. A physician being escorted out by security. And Ashley Cooper standing alone with something folded in her hands that looked like it had been through a firefight. The CEO approached Ashley first. Captain Cooper, on behalf of St. Michael's, I apologize for. Will Captain Webb's care be affected? Ashley's voice cut clean through apology. Deferential was gone. That voice had no please in it anymore. The CEO blinked. He'll receive the best care we can provide. Then we're done here. Ashley turned toward the exit, her movements carrying the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed emergency medicine while mortars fell. As security escorted Pierce toward the elevators, his face streaked with the sweat of a man watching his entire life dissolve into federal paperwork, nurses began to emerge from doorways like they were rising from the dead. One by one, they approached. A young RN Ashley had trained during night shift spoke quietly. He blamed me for a post-op infection. I almost lost my license. The patient died. An older nurse, hands that had held lives together for 28 years, he altered a chart when I questioned a medication order. 2-week suspension. Said it was my word against his documentation. The stories poured out like blood from a wound that had never healed. Pierce's pattern became visible in those accounts, 7 years of malpractice hidden behind documentation that blamed nurses, technicians, respiratory therapists, anyone below him in the hierarchy. The same bureaucratic weapon he'd tried to use against Ashley had been turned inward, revealing a trail of falsified charts, altered lab results, and patient deaths he'd carefully attributed to others. The investigation he'd launched to destroy Captain Cooper had triggered automatic federal alerts. Those alerts had uncovered his entire surgical history. The past 6 years would be spent in depositions and legal proceedings, his reputation converted to ash and scattered across federal court records. As Pierce disappeared into the elevator, flanked by security that moved with the weight of authority, the Marine colonel folded his citation back into the leather folder. He looked at Ashley one final time. "Welcome home, Captain." Ashley didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her eyes had already returned to Webb, to the folded flag she'd carried since Baghdad, to the nurses whose vindication was being purchased with her own exposure. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then everything began. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm curious, comment below and tell us if you're watching this alone or with family. Now let's see how this unfolds.